I am outside the Shenzhen Stock Exchange and I'm going to talk about currency in China, but more specifically I'm going to focus on the fact that in the late 19th century, when the Qing dynasty first introduced the yuan, it was based on the Mexican peso, and the reason behind this was because both nations were surprisingly linked on currency for centuries, going back to the Ming dynasty in fact. But first, a quick, very brief overview of currency in China. So going back to millennia, cowrie shells were used, and it's thought that because China was probably one of the first nations to use coin currency, that coins were in fact based on, well, at least representations of cowrie shells. Well, in fact, all sorts of currencies have been recorded to be used, like tortoise shells, stones, and the likes. But interestingly, too, I found interesting anyway, was knife currency and spade currency. Over time they reduced in size and just became representations of knives and spades, but I found that particularly interesting. Anyway, it was the Qing dynasty, as in Q-I-N, that introduced the coin with the square in the middle, the square cut out in the middle, and they largely united China behind one currency, which is pretty unique in their history because after the Qing dynasty, China became divided and each region began to use its own currency once again. I should say as well, copper was always sort of held as a currency here in China, but it wasn't a nationalized currency as such. Anyway, the Song dynasty around 1,000 years ago united China behind one currency once again, and that was paper money, the first country to do so. Then the Mongols invaded and they continued using paper money here in China, but they didn't base it on gold or silver. In fact, that made it the first fiat currency. But anyway, this brings me to the Ming dynasty and the Mexican peso. So the Ming tried to keep producing paper money, but they produced too much of it and inflation followed. So they stopped production around 1450. However, some private businesses kept producing their own money. But this was the same time that silver from the New World started arriving in China. Now this silver was standardized about 36 grams, a tael as we called it in Europe. So it made a very good currency because of the standardization, but again I should say that paper money, bronze and copper and the likes were also used as currency, so it wasn't just one. But this became incredibly popular, so when the Qing dynasty formed their new currency, it made sense to base it on the silver from Mexico. But this currency only survived as the national currency for a couple of decades because warlords, the Japanese occupiers, autonomous regions and the communists all made their own currencies. Plus, after the war, the yuan suffered from hyperinflation, and this was because they produced too much money trying to replace the currencies that the warlords, the Japanese and the likes had introduced. Now to put this hyperinflation into a bit of context, when the communists took over and introduced the renminbi, the currency they have today, one renminbi could be exchanged for around 100,000 yuan. Nevertheless, the yuan remained the currency of Taiwan for a period of time, but eventually got phased out and replaced by the Taiwanese dollar. Just to add to the end there, China did produce its own silver, especially during the Tang dynasty and the likes, but just not in the same quantity. And this silver was usually brought in via the Philippines, and it was later used to buy opium. In fact, the loss of the silver was one of the main reasons, as well as having millions of drug dealers, that they decided to ban the opium trade, and this eventually led to the Opium Wars.